Welcome to another watercolor tutorial with Aurora.watercolor. Please check the colors from my palette, so you can always refer back to this page at the beginning of the video. So we're going to start by drawing the outline of this apple. I'm using 300 grams cold press rough watercolor papers from Arches. I always suggest to use high quality paper because the difference is very obvious. Here I'm drawing some areas which are supposed to be the reflection of the highlights on the apple. When you are painting, try to always remember that those areas need to be lighter. Okay, I'm now starting to paint. The color that I'm choosing is lemon yellow, and it was already slightly mixed with some blue from a different work I did before. So what I'm trying to do here is clean my brush, water it down, and trying to clean the color so that it can be a bit lighter. I'm keeping the darker color next to it so that I can sort of dip in and out of the two colors. In many of my videos I've explained that you do not want to use a single shade of color because it will result to be very flat. So I can see here that in the center of the apple I was using the darker version of the lemon yellow, and then towards the edges outside I'm sticking to the lighter version of lemon yellow. Here I think I've added a little bit of cadmium yellow, which is slightly more warm. I'm using violet over there, and that is going to be applied to the apple whilst the paint is still wet, so that, as you can see at the top, is mixing up with the lemon yellow. This is supposed to be the darker areas of the apple. I'm watering down the color, and I'm covering the whole surface. Going back to the darker lemon yellow, I'm trying to be as quick as possible so that the two colors can merge together. So here I'm adding some ultramarine blue to my violet to create a dark purple, and I'm adding it to the wet color to increase the shadow the shade of my apple. Now I'm adding further ultramarine blue. I'm not mixing it to the violet this time, and I'm just applying it to the very bottom of the apple. I'm adding some intense blue to the ultramarine blue I already had, and some indigo, and this is because the mixing different kinds of blues in the same color allows you to keep the color not flat. For the shadow, I'm using indigo and a little bit of Payne's grey, and I'm watering down the edges of the shadow. The center of the shadow closer to the apple needs to be darker, and that's why I'm adding a lot of indigo there. I'm adding a little bit of violet now, and whilst the color is still wet, I'm carrying on adding layers. Be careful, if your watercolor paper is not thick enough, this can create some issues with the paper. Now the color is dry, and I'm going for some strong colors, quinacridone red and cadmium red, a little bit of permanent rose, because I want to create a very saturated red. I'm testing the color on some paper. And I'm now applying the color in the areas of light first. Underneath the highlights that I'm going to keep white, I'm making sure the color is very strong and intense, and this is because I want to exaggerate the contrast. I'm now adding a little bit of cadmium orange to my mix. As I explained many times, I don't want the color to be flat, and this is going to give the apple more of a realistic color. I'm going to paint my orange into the red. You have to be very quickly in doing so because the paint needs to be wet, otherwise you will see the lines of the layers. Here I've added some brown, some burnt umber. Basically it's to darken up the orange I already had, with some alizarin crimson, which is a very dark red. I'm going to paint the edges. Can you see that the paint is just letting itself flow into the drawing? So by drying off the brush, as I'm doing here, you are allowed to collect excess pigment so that you can create highlights that are not as strong as just leaving some blank paper. And you can do that to soften some areas that you think are oversaturated. Okay, now we are working on some areas that are darker, and I'm using some ultramarine blue mixed with a little bit of indigo and brown, the brown we had before, and that's what I insert in the center of the apple. And with the brown mixed to the red we already had, I'm working on the side of the apple. As you can see, there is an area where the paint underneath was already dry, and that's why we can see that line that is very visible, and that's what we should avoid really. Okay, so now we're working on the darker areas again. This part is now dry, so that's why we're going back to paint over it. I'm using brown mixed with those blues and then slowly getting darker. I'm adding some violet over there. We need to make sure the colors are all mixing together. We don't want each color to be concentrated in a specific area. We want them to gradually turn into each other. So here we want to gradually create this darker area. So continue to dry your brush and collect the pigment from the areas that are still wet, obviously, because if that was dry I wouldn't be able to collect the pigment anymore. And you're working on the highlights. I'm changing the brush there. I am using number 3. This brush is actually an amazing brush, which is a series created by this lovely watercolorist called Amazing. I suggest to follow her. She does very realistic watercolor paintings, and she has an online class I'm a big fan of. And I'm working on the very saturated sections of the apple that are very strong and red, and I'm basically going over and over with the same process and the same colors that I was working on earlier. So again, using my browns mixed to my blues for the center of the apple, collecting the excess pigment in the areas where I don't want the color to be. I'm adding some yellow there because I thought the color was a little bit too flat, and then resaturate again my reds. A quick tip here, I'm using a very watery wash of the reds, and I'm just painting around the edges of those highlights. This makes them look a lot more realistic, because a real highlight is not just white, it's gradual. Now I'm going back to my darks again. You need to be quick in all of this process, because especially when you start painting an area, you don't want it to dry, because every layer of color would just you would be able to see the lines of the layers if you weren't quick. So here, as you can see, I'm going darker with my reds, I'm adding violets to my reds, and adding indigo, and adding the blues, and I'm slowly, gradually but quickly moving towards the bottom of my apple. And you can see that the colors are becoming stronger and stronger. Given that the surface is round, as you can see in the middle of the spherical apple, there is a darker area, and that's where I dropped a little bit of I think it was Payne's grey and red. The bottom of the apple still needs to be light, because even though it is at the bottom, it reflects the light from the table or whatever surface it's lying on. Right, so now it's the moment to make the highlights pop out as much as possible, and I'm using Winsor & Newton white gouache. And we are going to paint directly inside the highlights we already had. If the gouache is watery enough, it's not going to be super white. which is okay. It might be the sort of less saturated white that, as you can see, I'm using around the very white highlights that I left just by not painting in those areas. And you can, as I'm doing here, I'm just watering it down and treating it as a watercolor. So it depends how thick you want the paint to be. Every time you add highlights or darker areas, you always feel like you want to recalibrate all the midtones. This is what I'm doing here. Basically, I added more highlights and then I decided I needed to work on my midtones. So you keep on going back and forth to try to rebalance all the colors until you feel like you have achieved what you were looking for. So I felt I was done here with my last few touches, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please follow me on my Instagram page, Aurora.watercolor, and I'll see you next time.